In 1811, a plantation owner in Spanish East Florida signed manumission papers for his 18-year-old wife, a Senegalese woman. He assured the Spanish authorities of her nicety and fidelity, as well as her good qualities. Her name was Anna Kingsley. Captured in the endemic violence of West Africa, she went on to lead an extraordinary life that deserves to be remembered. Anna Kingsley was born Anna Majagin Ndiaye in 1793 in Wolof, a kingdom in West Africa. The 18th century was a period of destabilization across the entire region, much of it driven by demand for slaves. Anna was an ethnic Wolof who lived in the Wolof kingdoms along the coast. The Wolof people established an empire encompassing much of the Senegal coast in the 14th century, but in the 16th century its constituent states were essentially independent, although nominally part of a confederacy. Slavery was a part of Wolof culture from its earliest recorded origins, and the Wolof people developed a strict caste system. European involvement in the slave trade, however, had a dramatic effect on West African culture. Slavery was incredibly lucrative, and kingdoms along the coast turned to larger and more frequent slave raids to satisfy European demand. As the kingdoms acquired firearms and wealth in exchange, the raids and battles between West African kingdoms became larger and fiercer. Slavery played a role in the deterioration of the Wolof Empire as coastal leaders gained prestige and power greater than the Wolof emperor, who ruled from inland. Villages were wiped out, and settlements were forced to become more defensive. Political stability eventually collapsed almost completely. As war became constant, the crisis reached a peak between 1790 and 1809, with one Englishman describing villages abandoned in 1811, and then people carried into captivity, and those who remain constantly subjected to plunder. This was the state of the region when Anta was born. The exact circumstances of her capture are unclear. Anna claimed to be from Senegal, and the name she kept from Africa, Majagin Jai, are Wolof in origin. She arrived in Florida in 1806, age 13. This coincides with a major raid into Wolof. Legends describe Anna as a princess, and the name Jai traces back to the possibly legendary founder of the Wolof kingdom. It is possible, though far from proven, that she was the child of a member of the royal family, and local legend in Senegal says she was the daughter of a failed contender for the throne. She was sold to European traders, taken across the Middle Passage to Havana, Cuba. This was in the waning years of the Atlantic slave trade, which was banned by multiple countries in the first decade of the 19th century. Sugar plantations in Cuba, however, kept demand for labor high. In September or October 1806, Anta was exhibited for sale and purchased by Zephaniah Kingsley, a slave trader and planter. Kingsley was born in England in 1765 and moved with his family to South Carolina as a child. By 1806, he was a successful slave trader. On the same trip, he also purchased two other young women, newly arrived from Africa. According to Kingsley, shortly after he met her, he married her by her native African custom, although never celebrated according to the forms of Christian usage. Despite the African marriage, from the beginning, Kingsley considered Anna his wife. On the journey to Florida, she stayed in his cabin, and upon arrival, she was sent not to the slave quarters, but to Kingsley's dwelling at Laurel Grove, Kingsley's plantation located northwest of St. Augustine. She was already pregnant with his child. Despite the age difference, 28 years, and the obvious power imbalance, Kingsley called Anna his wife for the rest of his life, and lived openly with her and their mixed-race children. He described Anna as a fine, tall figure, black as jet, but very handsome. She was very capable and could carry on all the affairs of the plantation in my absence, as well as I could myself. Though he was a slave owner and trader, Kingsley had unique and sometimes progressive views on slavery. He is known for writing the first published defense of slavery in the United States, but he didn't believe in erasing African culture or teaching Christianity to his slaves. He believed Africans were superior to whites, physically and morally. They were more healthy, have more graceful forms, softer skin, and sweeter voices. They are more docile and affectionate, more faithful in their attachments, and less prone to mischief than the white race. Most controversial, he believed in the benefit of free black communities and interracial marriage. He also believed in liberal manumission laws. At the same time, he remained part of an illicit slave trade into the southern states, smuggling enslaved people into the U.S. after the Atlantic slave trade had been abolished. Slavery in Spanish Florida was different than in the British colonies as well. Florida served as a safe haven for escaped slaves and for Native Americans who raided into Georgia, constant threat to social stability. Under Spanish law, enslaved people were not chattel and had some rights, such as to marry, to own property, and to buy their freedom. Kingsley had a standing policy of allowing his workers to buy their freedom for half their market value. Free blacks who accepted Catholicism were Spanish citizens. On March 4, 1811, Kingsley formally emancipated Anna. "Let it be known," he wrote, "that I possessed as a slave a black woman called Anna, and I have resolved to set her free." Additionally, he freed their 3 mixed-race children, George, Martha, and Mary. While Kingsley would take several other wives or mistresses, also slaves, Anna was always the most important, and visitors were often convinced that she was Kingsley's only wife. Kingsley wrote that he considered Anna's plantation management skills to be nearly equal to his own. If she had been wealthy in Wolof, the plantation system would have been quite familiar. Zephaniah traveled often and was rarely at his plantation, although he had numerous drivers that dealt with day-to-day issues. His plantations and mercantile enterprise made him an extremely wealthy man, one of the wealthiest in Florida. Just a year after her emancipation, Anna moved across the St. Johns River to Horse Landing, where Zephaniah built her a 2-story house on 5 acres Anna had been granted by the Spanish government. There she lived with her 3 children and 12 slaves. She would own enslaved people for most of the rest of her life. Of special note, apparently, was Anna's poultry yard. One observer wrote that he did not know another poultry yard in the country equal to that of Anna's. Unfortunately, Anna's world was soon threatened again, this time by the United States. In 1812, a group of Americans, under General George Matthews, a veteran of the Revolution, crossed the border from Georgia in the hopes of wrenching Florida from Spain. Matthews had been officially granted the authority to take temporary possession of the Floridas and accept the transfer to the United States, if possible. Congress passed a resolution and appropriated $100,000 to support the venture, with support from President Madison himself. Calling themselves the Patriots, the volunteers captured Fernandina on March 17, 1812. The invasion reached as far as the St. Johns River, where the Patriots captured Laurel Grove and used as a base for raiding. Zephaniah himself was captured in the first few days and held until he signed a pledge of support for the rebels. In the fighting between Patriots and Seminoles, Laurel Grove was burned to the ground. Anna faced considerable danger herself, including the very real threat that she would be captured and sold back into slavery. Kingsley's main residence remained standing as it was defended by a fence and several 4-pounder cannons. In November, Spanish gunboats assaulted the house until they wrecked the whole front of the house, although the rebels stayed firm. The gunboats then fired grape shot into the dwelling, which silenced resistance. Shortly afterwards, a canoe approached the gunboat from the shore. Aboard was Anna Kingsley. Anna warned the Spanish sailors of the Patriot strength and brought her children and slaves aboard for safety. Later that day, Anna led Spanish soldiers ashore to set a fire so that the house would burn and the rebels would not have this sanctuary. Returning to the gunboat, the captain was frustrated that he saw no smoke. Anna told him to wait and see, and soon smoke rose from the ruins of the house. She had lit a fire in a trunk, which delayed the conflagration long enough for her to escape. She then crossed to the other side of the river and burned down her own house, as it was more gratifying to lose it than that the enemy should take advantage. The Spanish commander wrote that Anna deserves any favor the governor can grant her. The royal order provides rewards for such services. She would receive a 350-acre grant for her heroism. The Patriot War fell apart when the U.S. government repudiated the assault out of fear that Spain would join Britain in the impending War of 1812, and the Kingsleys were soon working on rebuilding their life, this time on Fort George Island. Everything on the island had been destroyed in the fighting, but was now rebuilt, including her own house near Kingsley's main residence, now known as the Ma'am Anna House. The Kingsleys remained in peace at Fort George Island for most of 25 years. It's where Anna's children grew up, along with at least 2 other co-wives who had their own dwellings. She gave birth to her 4th and final child, John Maxwell Kingsley, in 1824 on the island. During this time, she visited with Susan L'Engle, the great-grandmother of author Madeleine L'Engle, who left an account of her great-grandmother's visits in the book The Summer of the Great-Grandmother. Susan L'Engle called Anna the African princess and said that she visited Anna weekly, where they talked and drank cold tea together. According to the book, Susan thought that Anna felt ostracized by both whites and blacks and nearly died of homesickness. Susan's friendship with Anna was rare for the time when such a friendship was unheard of. Susan simply laughed when she was criticized and sometimes slandered because of the relationship. Possibly the biggest change that Anna faced occurred in 1819, when the Adams-Onis Treaty officially ceded control of the Floridas to the United States. The change had its pros and cons. Zephaniah was optimistic about the economic situation, but American race relations were more strict than the rules under Spain. In 1823, President Monroe appointed Kingsley to serve on the Territorial Council, the ruling body of East Florida. Kingsley argued that the territory should keep the relatively liberal slave laws of Spain, which would encourage owners to manumit their slaves and support the rights of free blacks. But the council was full of American slave owners who saw free blacks as a threat, and rules were passed that limited the rights of free blacks, denying them the right to carry firearms, serve on juries, or testify against whites. Sheriffs were empowered to impress even free blacks for manual labor. Most seriously for Anna and Zephaniah, the territory made interracial marriage illegal and made it impossible for mixed-race children to inherit. Another law imposed heavy fines on white men who had sexual relations with black women. The territory discouraged manumission by requiring owners to pay $200 per emancipation, and the freed had to leave Florida within 30 days. Kingsley was disgusted, adding a note to his will which warned of the illiberal and inequitable laws of this territory and urging his family to emigrate to some land of liberty and equal rights, where the conditions of society are governed by some laws less absurd than that of color. Kingsley deeded land to his wives, but their safety and freedom were far from secure. Nat Turner's Rebellion, the Second Seminole War, and the rebellion in Haiti stoked racial fears that finally convinced Zephaniah to escape Florida. Kingsley decided to buy land and move most of his family to Haiti, although Anna's 2 daughters had married and would remain in Florida. He leased 35,000 acres on the north part of the island, which was later bought in his eldest son George's name. All of Kingsley's slaves were liberated when they reached Haiti, where slavery was illegal. Anna arrived to a growing plantation in 1838. Again, Anna's peace would last only a short time. In 1843, Kingsley, in his late 70s, arranged for his wives to be supported by his lands and put George in charge. He died on September 13th in New York City. Anna and Zephaniah had been married for 37 years. 3 years later, Anna forfeited her peace in Haiti to return to Florida. At stake was Zephaniah's property and money in Florida. Kingsley had been concerned that his heirs would break his will, and in 1844 his sister, not an heir, contested the will. His sister called the will defective and invalid and wanted his colored legatees barred from inheritance. The will required his assets split into 12 equal parts, with 7 given to Anna and her children, with the remaining 5 going to other wives and nephews. Kingsley's inheritance was enormous, worth millions in modern figures, and the fight promised to be contentious. By Florida law, no free black was allowed to migrate to Florida, which, along with their blackness, constituted the legal challenge by Kingsley's sister. It wasn't easy to return to Florida, but Anna finally did after George was drowned in a shipwreck, returning to Haiti from New York. Leaving Haiti meant forfeiting any income from the Haiti plantations, but the huge inheritance justified the move. The court case eventually ruled in Anna's favor, thanks to the Adams-Onis Treaty's promise that Spanish citizens receive full citizenship rights. Anna spent the rest of her life in Florida, directing the management of Zephaniah's estate. She focused her efforts on land she owned along the St. Johns River, located in modern Arlington. There, Anna was at the center of a growing settlement of free blacks, a rare thing in Florida in the 1840s and 50s. Anna's final ordeal occurred in 1861 when Florida seceded. 69 years old, she was again forced to flee from her home. Union forces reached Jacksonville in 1862, but chose not to garrison the city, and Anna, her children, grandchildren, and most of the free black community probably boarded Union ships to find safety in the North. They returned only after the war, though it isn't clear when. Unfortunately, the war had wiped out Anna's wealth. From 1865 until her death, she lived with one of her daughters. It isn't clear when Anna died, but it was probably in 1870, and definitely before June 18th, when her grandchildren delivered the will to the Court of Probate. No report of her death, which could have been earlier, has been found. Her resting place is similarly unknown, but is probably in the family cemetery, unmarked. Despite all the challenges she faced, repeatedly losing her home, often living in fear for her life and her freedom, Anna Kingsley remained a formidable woman her entire life. She was smart and capable and brave, and often faced difficulties head-on despite obstacles and disadvantages. She left almost nothing to tell us about her life in her own words. There's no diaries, no letters, no memoir. She died far from home, but surrounded by a family that she had defended and built. Penniless, but hardly poor. The site of the Kingsley Plantation on Fort George Island in Duval County, Florida, is now part of the Timucuan Ecological and Historical Preserve, managed by the United States National Park Service. Numerous descendants of Anna Kingsley thrive today, primarily in the United States and the Dominican Republic. The story of Anna Kingsley is a complex one that represents the many strange situations and contradictions of the relationship between the enslaved, the free, and the slave owner in the 18th and 19th centuries in the New World. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.